Have you ever wondered why some people seem to pick up new languages effortlessly, while others struggle for years with little progress? The secret might be simpler than you think. Welcome to LMJ English, where today we're diving into the single most powerful tool for mastering the English language, something so accessible yet tragically overlooked by most language learners. Hello there, language enthusiasts. I'm thrilled to have you join us today for what might be the most important lesson I'll ever share with you. Whether you're just starting your English journey or you've been studying for years, what you'll learn today could completely transform your approach and accelerate your progress beyond what you thought possible. Before we begin, if you're new to this channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By joining our community, you'll get access to proven strategies that have helped thousands of English learners just like you achieve fluency faster than they ever thought possible. Today, we're exploring the extraordinary power of reading and why it might be the missing piece in your language learning puzzle. You've probably been told to practice speaking, to listen to native speakers, to memorize grammar rules and vocabulary lists. But what if I told you there's a method that improves almost all of these skills simultaneously, feels less like work, and has been scientifically proven to be more effective? Let's unlock the secret that successful language learners have known for generations: the transformative power of reading for pleasure. The growing necessity of reading in our modern world. In today's rapidly evolving society, reading skills have never been more crucial. Just consider this striking statistic. Back in 2006, only 1 out of every 100 people pursued higher education. Fast forward to today, and that number has jumped to 7 out of every 100. This sevenfold increase reflects a fundamental shift in our educational landscape, where advanced literacy is becoming the norm rather than the exception. This transformation extends far beyond the ivory towers of academia. Look around at any workplace today, and you'll see a stark contrast to the jobs of a century ago. From construction sites to corporate boardrooms, from hospitals to hair salons, every profession now demands significantly more reading and writing proficiency than ever before. The mechanic who once relied purely on manual skills now needs to read complex digital diagnostic reports. The restaurant server who once memorized orders now navigates sophisticated ordering systems requiring reading comprehension. The digital revolution has democratized information while simultaneously raising the bar for literacy. Emails have replaced phone calls. Text messages have replaced conversations. Social media updates have replaced water cooler chats. In this tech-saturated environment, those who read efficiently have a distinct advantage in both their professional and personal lives. What's particularly fascinating is how universal this trend has become. It doesn't matter if you're working in a traditional blue-collar job or pursuing a high-flying corporate career. The ability to process written information quickly and accurately has become a non-negotiable skill. The factory worker needs to understand safety protocols and operating instructions. The executive needs to digest market reports and strategic communications. Both require reading proficiency that would have been considered advanced just decades ago. For English language learners, this presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge lies in mastering not just conversational English, but also the more formal, information-dense English of written communication. The opportunity, however, is that focusing on reading skills can provide an accelerated path to overall language proficiency that serves multiple purposes at once. In a world where everyone needs to read more, developing strong reading skills in English isn't just about language learning. It's about preparing for success in a text-driven global economy. This isn't merely speculation or personal opinion. Educational researchers have tracked this trend for decades, noting how reading requirements have steadily increased across professions. Jobs that once required minimal literacy now demand extensive reading abilities, and positions that already required reading now expected at higher levels of sophistication and speed. When we consider this reality, it becomes clear that reading isn't just one aspect of language learning. It might be the most practical and immediately applicable skill for anyone looking to thrive in today's interconnected world. The comprehensive benefits of reading for language acquisition. When most language students think about improving their English, they immediately gravitate toward conversation practice or listening exercises. While these activities certainly have their place, they often overlook the remarkable efficiency of reading as a tool for comprehensive language development. Reading doesn't just improve a single aspect of your language skills. It enhances almost every dimension simultaneously. Let's start with speaking. It might seem counterintuitive that a silent activity like reading could improve your verbal communication, but the connection is powerful. When you read extensively, you're constantly exposing yourself to natural sentence patterns, idiomatic expressions, and contextual vocabulary usage. These structures become internalized, creating a rich repository of linguistic resources that become available when you speak. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how well-read people tend to express themselves more eloquently, even in casual conversation? That's not coincidental. The language patterns they've absorbed through reading naturally flow into their speech. The connection between reading and writing skills is perhaps more obvious but no less significant. As you read, you're continuously observing how ideas are organized, how paragraphs flow together, how arguments are constructed, and how punctuation is used. You're absorbing the conventions of written English without the tedious process of memorizing rules. Many language learners struggle with writing precisely because they haven't read enough in their target language. They may know individual words and grammar rules, but they lack the intuitive sense of how these elements come together in authentic writing. Vocabulary acquisition through reading is particularly efficient because you encounter words in meaningful contexts. Rather than attempting to memorize isolated word lists, you see how words function in sentences, which meanings are activated in which contexts, and how words relate to one another. This contextual learning leads to deeper understanding and better retention. Even more impressively, research has shown that we can often infer the meanings of unfamiliar words when they appear in comprehensible contexts, allowing for natural vocabulary growth without constant dictionary use. Perhaps the most underappreciated benefit of reading is how it facilitates natural grammar absorption. Traditional grammar instruction often involves memorizing rules, studying exceptions, and completing artificial exercises. In contrast, reading exposes you to grammar in action. You see how native speakers actually use the language rather than how textbooks say it should be used. This repeated exposure helps you develop an intuitive feel for grammatical correctness without conscious analysis. It's remarkably similar to how children acquire their first language, not through grammar lessons, but through constant exposure to language patterns. While reading won't directly improve your listening skills in the same way that audio materials will, it creates a foundation that makes listening comprehension much easier. The broader your vocabulary and the more familiar you are with English sentence structures, the more easily you'll recognize these elements when you hear them. Many language learners hit a plateau in listening comprehension because they simply don't recognize enough words. Reading extensively can dramatically expand your recognition vocabulary, which in turn enhances your ability to process spoken English. What makes reading particularly valuable is its efficiency. In a single activity, you're simultaneously developing multiple language skills. This integrated approach mirrors how we naturally acquire languages, not as separate components, but as an interconnected system. By making reading a core part of your language learning routine, you're leveraging one of the most time-efficient methods available for overall English improvement. The revolutionary concept of reading for pleasure in language learning. When I mention reading as a language learning strategy, many students immediately imagine dense textbooks, complicated literature with unfamiliar vocabulary, or boring passages followed by comprehension questions. Their faces fall as they recall unpleasant memories of required reading assignments that felt more like punishment than learning. But I'm advocating for something entirely different, something that educational researchers call recreational reading or reading for pleasure. Reading for pleasure means exactly what it sounds like. Reading because you want to, because you enjoy it, because the content interests you. It's reading without tests, without assignments, without pressure to analyze or evaluate. It's reading that you choose to do, not reading that you're forced to do. And this distinction makes all the difference in the world when it comes to language acquisition. When you read for pleasure, something remarkable happens in your brain. Rather than struggling through text with the conscious effort of analyzing grammar and vocabulary, you become absorbed in the content itself. Your attention shifts from the language to the message. You're no longer thinking, this is a present perfect continuous tense, but rather, I wonder what will happen next in this story. This shift is crucial because it allows language processing to become more automatic and subconscious, exactly how natural language acquisition works. The power of motivation in language learning cannot be overstated. When you're genuinely interested in what you're reading, you'll willingly spend more time engaged with the language. You'll continue reading past the point where you would normally give up on a textbook exercise. You'll look forward to returning to your book, creating a sustainable habit that accumulates massive language exposure over time. This motivated engagement is worth its weight in gold for language acquisition. Freedom of choice is another essential element of reading for pleasure. Traditional language instruction often assumes that all students need to learn the same vocabulary and read the same texts. But this one-size-fits-all approach ignores the vast differences in interests, backgrounds, and goals among language learners. When you choose your own reading material, you can select topics that are relevant to your specific needs and interests. If you're learning English for business purposes, you might choose articles about entrepreneurship or leadership. If you're interested in cooking, you might read food blogs or recipes. This personalized approach ensures that the language you're acquiring is directly relevant to your goals. Some language educators resist the idea of recreational reading because it seems too unstructured, too casual, or too difficult to measure progress. They worry that without clear objectives and assessments, learning will be haphazard or incomplete. But research consistently shows that free voluntary reading leads to impressive gains in vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing style, and even grammatical accuracy. The key is volume and consistency. Reading regularly and extensively over time produces remarkable results, even without formal study of the texts. The shift from viewing reading as an assignment to seeing it as a pleasure doesn't happen overnight, especially for those who have had negative experiences with reading in the past. It requires starting with highly accessible, genuinely engaging materials. It means giving yourself permission to stop reading something that doesn't capture your interest. It involves prioritizing enjoyment over educational value, trusting that the language benefits will follow naturally when you're engaged with the content. For many successful language learners, this transition to reading for pleasure marks a turning point in their progress. It transforms language learning from something that happens during designated study time to something that enriches their daily life. It converts English from a subject to be learned into a tool for accessing information and entertainment. Most importantly, it makes the entire process sustainable over the long term, which is essential for reaching advanced proficiency in any language. Scientific evidence supporting the reading approach to language mastery. The idea that reading, particularly reading for pleasure, can dramatically accelerate language learning isn't just an interesting theory. It's supported by compelling scientific evidence from multiple studies spanning different countries, age groups, and learning contexts. These research findings provide a solid foundation for reconsidering how we approach language education. One of the most fascinating studies comes from an unlikely setting: juvenile delinquent reform centers in America in 1965. Researchers were interested in whether providing access to enjoyable reading materials, without any educational requirements attached, would impact literacy skills. They selected a group of young offenders and gave them free books chosen specifically to appeal to teenage boys, exciting novels like James Bond adventures rather than educational texts. Crucially, the boys were under no obligation to read these books. They weren't tested on the content, they received no rewards for reading, and they faced no consequences if they ignored the books entirely. What happened next was remarkable. Despite the absence of any external pressure, the boys voluntarily engaged with the books. Many became avid readers, with some completing a new book every 2 days. After 2 years, researchers measured their literacy skills and found dramatic improvements in both reading and writing abilities. Even more significantly, their attitude toward education had shifted positively. Meanwhile, a control group that didn't receive books showed no improvement, and some even regressed in their literacy skills during the same period. This experiment demonstrated something powerful. When reading materials are accessible and engaging, people will read voluntarily, and significant learning occurs without formal instruction. The improvement happened not because the boys were studying language, but because they were absorbed in stories that captured their interest. Similar findings have emerged from studies of English language learners. In the Fiji Islands, researchers compared 3 different approaches to teaching English as a second language. One group received traditional instruction focused on grammar exercises and structured lessons. Another group participated in sustained silent reading, where they simply read books in English during class time. A third group experienced a more conventional reading program where teachers read aloud to students. After 1 year, the results were clear. Students in both reading-focused programs had made significantly more progress than those in the traditional program. The reading groups had achieved gains equivalent to 15 months of language development, compared to just 6.5 months for the traditional method. This means the reading approach was more than twice as effective as conventional language instruction. When researchers replicated this study in Singapore, they discovered something even more striking. Students who engaged exclusively in sustained silent reading, with no grammar lessons whatsoever, outperformed students who had received only grammar instruction when tested specifically on grammar knowledge. This counterintuitive finding suggests that we acquire grammar more effectively through exposure to language in meaningful contexts than through explicit study of grammatical rules. The consistent pattern across these studies challenges some deeply held assumptions about language learning. Traditional approaches emphasize conscious learning of rules, explicit vocabulary instruction, and control practice exercises. These methods assume that language acquisition is primarily a conscious, analytical process. But the research on reading suggests that much of language acquisition happens implicitly through exposure to comprehensible input in meaningful contexts. This aligns with what linguists call the input hypothesis, which proposes that we acquire language primarily by understanding messages, not by studying rules or practicing production. According to this theory, speaking, writing, and grammatical accuracy develop naturally as a result of sufficient comprehensible input, and reading provides an excellent source of such input. The scientific evidence doesn't suggest that traditional language instruction has no value, but it does indicate that many language programs may be significantly underutilizing reading as a learning tool. By incorporating more extensive reading into language curricula and encouraging learners to read for pleasure outside of class, we could potentially accelerate language acquisition while making the process more enjoyable and sustainable. Strategies for overcoming the reading challenge. I understand the benefits of reading, but when I try to read in English, it's just too difficult. I get frustrated looking up every other word in the dictionary, and I give up after a few paragraphs. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. This is perhaps the most common objection I hear from language learners when I recommend reading as a primary learning strategy. The good news is that this challenge can be overcome with the right approach. The most critical factor in successful reading for language acquisition is selecting materials at the appropriate level. Many learners make the mistake of trying to read authentic materials intended for native speakers before they're ready. They open a novel written for adult native speakers, encounter dozens of unknown words on the first page, and naturally conclude that reading in English is beyond their current abilities. This is like trying to run a marathon when you've just learned to walk. It's setting yourself up for frustration and failure. Research in second language acquisition has established what's called the comprehensible input hypothesis, which suggests that we learn best from language that is just slightly above our current level, challenging enough to contain some new elements, but familiar enough that we can understand the overall message. For reading, this means finding materials where you understand approximately 98% of the words on the page. This 98% comprehension threshold might sound surprisingly high, but it makes sense when you consider how reading works. If you understand 98% of the words, that's still about one unknown word in every 2 sentences. Plenty of new vocabulary to acquire without disrupting your understanding of the text. In contrast, if you understand only 90% of the words, that's one unknown word in every sentence, which makes it difficult to maintain comprehension and enjoy the reading experience. To illustrate this principle, consider this paragraph where I've replaced 10% of the words with nonsense terms. Jerry jumped out of bed and opened the curtains. It was a beautiful morning. He blavened to himself as he prepared breakfast, making coffee and buttering his toast. Suddenly, his phone rangified, and the person grunting was so unexpected that he dropped his Meckler on the floor. Even with 90% of the words being familiar, this paragraph is challenging to understand fully. The nonsense words create gaps that interrupt the flow of meaning and make the reading experience less enjoyable. Now compare that with this version, where only 2% of the words are replaced. Jerry jumped out of bed and opened the curtains. It was a beautiful morning. He sang to himself as he prepared breakfast, making coffee and buttering his toast. Suddenly, his phone rang, and the person calling was so unexpected that he dropped his Meckler on the floor. With 98% comprehension, you can easily understand the overall meaning even though one word remains unknown. You might even correctly guess that a Meckler is some object Jerry was holding that he dropped in surprise, perhaps his coffee mug or phone. This is exactly how we naturally acquire vocabulary, through context when reading at the right level. Finding materials at this sweet spot of difficulty is the key challenge for language learners. Fortunately, there are several approaches that can help. Graded readers are books specifically designed for language learners, with controlled vocabulary and grammatical structures matched to different proficiency levels. These allow you to find reading materials precisely calibrated to your current abilities. Another approach is to read translations of books you're already familiar with in your native language. The known context makes it easier to understand the English version. Children's books, while sometimes dismissed as too simple, often provide excellent starting points with their clear language and engaging stories. Digital reading platforms offer additional advantages, such as built-in dictionaries that allow you to look up words with a simple tap, rather than interrupting your reading to consult a physical dictionary. Some platforms even track which words you look up and create personalized vocabulary reviews based on your reading. The most important strategy, however, is giving yourself permission to prioritize enjoyment and comprehension over challenging yourself. Many learners feel guilty reading easy books, believing they should push themselves toward more difficult materials. But extensive reading at a comfortable level is far more beneficial than struggling through small amounts of advanced text. The sheer volume of language exposure you get from reading extensively at a lower level will ultimately lead to greater progress than limited exposure to more complex language. Remember, the goal is to reach a point where reading becomes pleasurable rather than painful. We are focused on the content rather than struggling with the language. Once reading becomes enjoyable, you'll naturally spend more time doing it, creating a positive cycle that accelerates your language acquisition. The surprising validity of simple reading materials. One of the most common objections I hear from serious language learners, particularly those studying for academic or professional purposes, goes something like this. I can't waste time reading fairy tales or simple stories. I need specialized vocabulary for my field. I need to read business reports, scientific papers, or legal documents, not children's literature or popular fiction. This objection seems logical on the surface. If you're learning English to work in medicine, shouldn't you focus on medical texts? If you need English for engineering, shouldn't you prioritize technical materials? While this targeted approach seems efficient, research in language acquisition reveals a surprising truth. The vocabulary divide between simple texts and specialized fields is much smaller than most people assume. A groundbreaking study by McQuillan examined the vocabulary used in 22 novels, not academic works, just ordinary fiction, and compared it to academic word lists. The findings were eye-opening. 85% of the words that appear on academic word lists also appeared in these novels. This means that by reading fiction, you're already acquiring the vast majority of vocabulary you'll need for academic purposes. Similarly, Rolls and Rogers conducted research specifically examining whether reading science fiction novels would help students acquire technical vocabulary needed for science degrees. Again, the results challenged conventional wisdom. Students who read 1 million words of science fiction, approximately 20 novels, encountered many of the technical terms they would later need in their scientific studies. The fictional context actually made these terms more memorable than encountering them in dry textbooks. This pattern extends across multiple domains. Business vocabulary appears naturally in stories about entrepreneurs or workplace dynamics. Legal terminology emerges in crime novels and courtroom dramas. Medical language surfaces in hospital scenes and descriptions of injuries or illnesses. While specialized fields certainly have unique technical terms, these represent a relatively small percentage of the overall vocabulary you need to master. There's also an important psychological dimension to consider. Technical texts are typically dense, informationally complex, and, let's be honest, often quite boring, especially for beginners. This makes them poor choices for extensive reading practice, where enjoyment and flow are crucial. In contrast, well-written stories engage our emotions and curiosity, motivating us to continue reading for longer periods. This sustained attention is exactly what's needed for language acquisition to occur efficiently. Moreover, specialized vocabulary is only useful when built upon a solid foundation of general language proficiency. Understanding technical terms in isolation doesn't help if you can't comprehend the sentences in which they appear. By building strong general reading skills through enjoyable materials, you develop the linguistic framework necessary to later absorb specialized terminology effectively. Another overlooked advantage of simpler reading materials is that they often contain more conversational language patterns. While academic texts might teach you formal writing conventions, stories and fiction expose you to dialogue, idioms, and everyday expressions that are essential for real-world communication. This balanced language diet ensures you develop both formal and informal registers of English. The fairy tales and simple stories I've mentioned earlier aren't just easy reading options. They're culturally significant texts that native speakers grow up with. These shared cultural references appear constantly in conversations, speeches, advertisements, and other media. Understanding these allusions and their associated moral lessons gives you cultural literacy alongside language skills. None of this means that field-specific reading has no place in language learning. As you advance, gradually incorporating materials related to your professional interests makes perfect sense. But the research suggests that you don't need to rush towards specialized texts. By first building a strong foundation through enjoyable, comprehensible reading, you'll actually accelerate your journey toward mastering specialized language rather than delaying it. The most efficient approach combines both strategies, reading extensively from materials you enjoy to build overall language proficiency, while gradually introducing more specialized texts as your general reading skills develop. This balanced approach ensures you develop both breadth and depth in your English abilities, preparing you for success across multiple contexts. My Spanish Revolution, a personal case study in reading-based language acquisition. Theory and research are valuable, but sometimes a personal story can illustrate principles more vividly. So let me share my own experience applying these reading-based methods to learn Spanish, a journey that transformed my understanding of language acquisition and convinced me that reading truly is the secret weapon for language learners. After years of teaching English, I had developed strong opinions about language methodology. I understood the theories behind comprehensible input and extensive reading, but I hadn't personally experienced their full power as a language learner. In 2017, I decided to put these principles to the test with an ambitious project. I would read 1 million words in Spanish and see what level I could achieve through primarily reading-based study. 1 million words is approximately equivalent to 20 average-length novels, a substantial but achievable goal within a year of consistent reading. I had previously attempted to learn Spanish through conventional methods, including Duolingo and conversation classes, but had made limited progress. This will be a completely different approach, prioritizing input over output and focusing on quantity of exposure rather than deliberate practice of specific skills. I began with extremely simple materials, the Spanish equivalent of graded readers designed for beginners. These basic texts allowed me to start building reading fluency without constant dictionary use. I also listened to beginner podcasts, but made sure to read the transcripts as well, counting those words toward my million-word goal. As my Spanish improved, I transitioned to translations of books I was already familiar with in English. This strategy proved particularly effective because my knowledge of the plots and characters provided contextual support for understanding the Spanish text. Harry Potter became my trusted companion in this phase, a novel with engaging content but relatively straightforward language. The familiarity of the story allowed me to focus on absorbing the language patterns rather than struggling to follow the plot. By the middle stages of my experiment, I was ready to attempt original Spanish literature. This was a significant milestone, reading works that were written in Spanish rather than translated from English. I discovered the rich world of Latin American literature, falling in love with authors like Isabel Allende, Jorge Luis Borges, and Manuel Puig. These weren't simplified texts for language learners, but authentic cultural products intended for native speakers. Throughout this process, I maintained a relatively passive approach to vocabulary and grammar. I didn't create flashcards, I didn't do grammar exercises, and I didn't force myself to memorize verb conjugations. Instead, I trusted that repeated exposure to language patterns within meaningful contexts would lead to natural acquisition. When I encountered unfamiliar words, I looked them up only if they seemed essential for understanding the main points of the text. Otherwise, I kept reading, allowing context to gradually clarify meanings over time. After approximately 1 year and 1 million words, I put my Spanish to the test. Without any significant speaking practice during my learning period, I engaged in conversations with native speakers. The results were remarkable. I could understand most of what was said to me, express my thoughts on a wide range of topics, and navigate everyday situations with reasonable comfort. My accent wasn't perfect, and I occasionally made grammatical errors, but I had reached a solid intermediate level, what language educators would classify as B1 or B2 on the Common European Framework. What struck me most was how this compared to traditional language learning timelines. Many students study a language for 5 years or more in formal educational settings and achieve less functional ability than I had developed in a single year of focused reading. The efficiency of the approach was undeniable. By engaging with massive amounts of comprehensible input, I had internalized the patterns of Spanish without the tedious process of memorizing rules and exceptions. The experience wasn't just efficient, it was enjoyable. Unlike the frustration I had previously experienced with grammar-focused approaches, reading allowed me to enjoy the process of language acquisition. I wasn't studying Spanish. I was reading interesting content that happened to be in Spanish. This distinction made all the difference in maintaining motivation over the long term. My vocabulary development was particularly impressive. Without deliberate vocabulary study, I had acquired thousands of words simply through repeated exposure in various contexts. When I encountered these words in conversation, they felt familiar, not because I had memorized them, but because I had seen them used naturally dozens or even hundreds of times in my reading. This experience fundamentally changed how I approach language teaching. I became convinced that extensive reading isn't just one technique among many. It's the central pillar around which other language learning activities should be organized. When students ask me how to improve their English now, my first recommendation is always to establish a regular reading habit with appropriate materials. The research was right all along. Reading truly is the most efficient path to language proficiency. Practical guidance for beginning your reading journey. Having explored the theory, research, and personal examples supporting reading-based language acquisition, let's turn to practical implementation. How exactly should you apply these principles to your own English learning journey? Where should you start, and how should you progress? The single most important factor in successful reading for language acquisition is selecting the right materials. This decision will determine whether reading becomes a sustainable, enjoyable habit or just another abandoned language learning attempt. The ideal reading material meets 3 critical criteria. It's comprehensible, it's engaging, and it's accessible in sufficient quantity. Comprehensibility means you understand enough of the text to follow the main ideas without constant dictionary use. As mentioned earlier, research suggests aiming for approximately 98% comprehension, where you understand all but about 1 word per paragraph. This level allows you to infer meanings from context while still encountering enough new language to make progress. For beginners, This typically means starting with materials specifically designed for language learners. Graded readers are books written with controlled vocabulary and grammar, categorized by proficiency level. Many publishers produce excellent graded reader series with engaging stories across various genres, from simplified classics to original mysteries, romances, and adventures. These provide an ideal entry point into reading in English. Another excellent option for beginners is children's books. Don't be embarrassed about reading materials intended for younger audiences. The language learning benefits are substantial regardless of the content's target age. Children's books often contain natural, conversational language with supportive illustrations that aid comprehension. They're also typically shorter, allowing you to experience the satisfaction of completing an entire book even at early stages. As you progress, translations of familiar books become valuable resources. If you've read Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, or other popular series in your native language, reading the English translations provides built-in context that supports understanding. You already know the characters and plot, allowing you to focus on the language itself rather than struggling to follow the story. Beyond comprehensibility, engagement is crucial. This means choosing materials that genuinely interest you, not what you think you should be reading. If you enjoy crime novels, read crime novels in English. If you're fascinated by history, find historical texts at your level. If celebrity gossip captures your attention, start with entertainment magazines. The subject matter is far less important than your interest in it. Many language learners make the mistake of forcing themselves to read serious literature or academic texts because they believe these materials are more educational. But if these texts bore you in your native language, they'll be even less engaging in English. Reading material that genuinely interests you ensures you'll continue reading long enough to reap the benefits. Accessibility refers to having enough reading material available to establish a regular reading habit. Ideally, you should have access to multiple books or articles at your appropriate level, so that when you finish one, you can immediately start another. Digital reading platforms like Amazon Kindle, libraries with English sections, or subscription services like Scribd can be valuable resources for maintaining a steady supply of reading material. Once you've selected appropriate materials, establish a sustainable reading routine. Consistency matters more than duration. Reading for 15 to 30 minutes daily is more beneficial than occasional marathon sessions. Many successful language learners incorporate reading into existing routines, such as reading before bed, during breakfast, or on public transportation. As you read, focus on understanding the overall meaning rather than every individual word. When you encounter unfamiliar vocabulary, try to guess the meaning from context before reaching for a dictionary. Only look up words that seem essential for understanding the main points or that appear repeatedly. This approach maintains reading flow while still supporting vocabulary acquisition. Don't worry about comprehension exercises, note-taking, or other study activities associated with reading. The primary benefit comes from the extensive exposure to language patterns, not from analyzing the text. Simply reading, and reading a lot, is sufficient to drive significant language improvement. As your proficiency increases, gradually move toward more challenging materials. This progression should be guided by your comfort level rather than external benchmarks. When your current reading material begins to feel too easy, when you're reading smoothly with very few unfamiliar words, it's time to step up to the next level. Remember that rereading familiar materials can be extremely valuable. Reading the same book multiple times, perhaps first in a simplified version, then in the original, allows you to notice different language features with each pass. Don't feel that you must always move on to new content. Returning to favorite texts can reinforce language patterns and build confidence. Finally, complement your reading with other language activities. While reading provides excellent input, Combining it with listening, speaking, and writing creates a more balanced language learning approach. Listen to audiobooks while following along with the text. Discuss what you've read with other English learners or teachers. Write summaries or reactions to stories you've enjoyed. These complementary activities build on the foundation that reading provides. Conclusion: embracing the reader's advantage. Throughout this exploration of reading as a language learning method, we've uncovered compelling evidence for what might be called the reader's advantage in second language acquisition. From scientific studies to personal experiences, from linguistic theories to practical strategies, a consistent message emerges. Those who read extensively in their target language progress faster, retain more, and ultimately achieve higher levels of proficiency than those who rely primarily on other methods. This advantage manifests across all aspects of language ability. Readers develop richer vocabulary, more accurate grammar, more natural writing style, and even more fluent speaking, all from an activity that many find intrinsically enjoyable. Unlike the tedious memorization of word lists or the mechanical repetition of grammar drills, reading engages our minds with meaningful content, allowing language acquisition to occur naturally, the way it did when we learned our first language. The most powerful aspect of reading-based language learning is its sustainability. Many language learning methods rely on willpower and discipline to push through boring or difficult exercises. But reading for pleasure taps into intrinsic motivation, the desire to follow a story, learn new information, or be entertained. This makes it possible to maintain consistent language exposure over months and years, accumulating the massive input necessary for high-level proficiency. For too long, language education has undervalued extensive reading in favor of structured instruction and deliberate practice. While these approaches have their place, the research clearly shows that incorporating substantial amounts of reading, particularly self-selected, enjoyable reading, could dramatically improve outcomes for language learners worldwide. Whether you're learning in a classroom setting or independently, making reading a central component of your language learning strategy will accelerate your progress. As you embark on or continue your English learning journey, I encourage you to embrace the reader's identity. See yourself not just as a language student, but as someone who reads in English, who enjoys stories, gathers information, and experiences new ideas through English text. This shift in identity carries profound implications for your relationship with a language and your ultimate success in mastering it. Start where you are, with materials you can understand and enjoy. Build reading into your daily routine, even if just for a few minutes at first. Trust the process, knowing that each page you read contributes to your language development, even without conscious study. Gradually increase both the quantity and challenge level of your reading as your skills develop. Remember that language learning is not a race, but a journey. The goal isn't perfect mastery of English grammar or pronunciation. It's developing the ability to communicate, to understand and be understood, to access the wealth of information and entertainment available in English. Reading opens doors to this world more efficiently than any other single activity. So pick up a book, a magazine, or an e-reader. Find something in English that captures your interest, and start reading. Your future fluent self will thank you for it. And there you have it, my friends, the secret to English mastery that most language courses won't tell you about. I hope this journey through the power of reading has inspired you to pick up a book, magazine, or e-reader and make reading a central part of your language learning strategy. If you found this information valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and share this video with fellow English learners who might benefit from this approach. Your support helps our content reach more people who are on their language learning journey. Have you already experienced the benefits of reading in English? Or are you just starting your reading journey? I'd love to hear about your favorite English books or reading strategies in the comments below. Your experiences might inspire others in our community to discover their next great read. Don't forget to subscribe to LMJ English for more evidence-based strategies that will accelerate your English proficiency. We publish new videos every week designed to help you achieve fluency faster and with more enjoyment. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until our next lesson, happy reading and happy learning. Key vocabulary from the story. Acquisition, noun, the process of gaining knowledge or learning something. Reading leads to natural language acquisition without memorization. Comprehensible, adjective, able to be understood. The ideal reading material should be comprehensible at about 98% for optimal learning. Proficiency, noun, a high degree of skill or expertise. Reading is the best way to improve proficiency in English overall. Sustained, adjective, continuing for an extended period. Sustained silent reading proved more effective than traditional grammar lessons. Intrinsic, adjective, belonging naturally to something. Reading taps into intrinsic motivation rather than requiring external pressure. Recreational, adjective, relating to activities done for enjoyment. Recreational reading is more effective than forced academic reading. Exposure, noun, the state of being in contact with something. Massive exposure to English through reading builds language skills naturally. Compelling, adjective, evoking interest, attention, or admiration. The evidence supporting reading-based language learning is compelling. Threshold, noun, a level or point at which something starts to happen. The 98% comprehension threshold allows for optimal language acquisition. Inference, noun, a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence. Readers develop the ability to make inferences about unknown words from context. Deliberate, adjective, done consciously and intentionally. Traditional approaches focus on deliberate practice rather than natural acquisition. Plateau, noun, a state of little or no change following a period of progress. Many language learners hit a plateau when they don't read enough. Counterintuitive, adjective, contrary to intuition or common sense. It seems counterintuitive that reading improves speaking, but research confirms it. Tedious, adjective, too long, slow, or dull, tiresome, or monotonous. Reading helps avoid tedious memorization of grammar rules. Accessible, adjective, able to be reached, entered, or used. Finding accessible reading materials at your level is crucial for success. Calibrated, adjective, carefully assessed, set, or adjusted. Graded readers are calibrated to match different proficiency levels. Progression, noun, the process of developing gradually. Reading allows for natural progression from simple to complex language. Efficient, adjective, achieving maximum productivity with minimum wasted effort. Reading is the most efficient method for overall language improvement. Sustainable, adjective, able to be maintained at a certain rate or level. Reading for pleasure creates a sustainable language learning habit. Extensive, adjective, covering or affecting a large area or many things. Extensive reading refers to reading large quantities of material at a comfortable level. Example, the acquisition of new vocabulary happens naturally when you read extensively in your target language.